As you can see from our title slide, today is finally the lecture I told you at the start of term was going to be my favorite. That is, today we're going to start looking into the set of interlocking phenomena that drive Europe eventually to the point of the most horrible war up to that point in human history, and only outdone by, if you will, its concluding second act 30 years later. Before diving into the, for lack of a better word, the causes of the war, those factors that are ultimately going to produce the conflagration of 1914, I'd like to begin with a quote from the author of your chapter for this week. That is the British historian Eric Hobsbawm, whose text on the long 19th century you've been reading these first few weeks of class, and we'll see once more later in the semester when we do our lectures on the end of the European empires. But this quote comes from his chapter, From Peace to War, final chapter of the Age of Empire. An excellent book, whatever its flaws. And here it is, and it's something I want you to think about as I take us through the narrative today. The problem of discovering the origins of the First World War is not one of discovering the quote-unquote aggressor. It lies in the nature of a progressively deteriorating international situation which increasingly escaped from the control of governments. So, what does he mean? Well, on the first slide, if you take a look on Blackboard, you'll see a list of several things that are going to combine to produce the circumstance for the war. And after just running through these quickly so you're familiar with them, ready to think about them, primed to think about them, I'm going to take you back to where we left off our story in the year of German unification, 1870-71, and take it all the way up to 1914. As an aside, fear not, I will be filling in those first 14 years of the 20th century over the course of our ensuing lectures. I just think it makes sense to tie this odd half century into a single narrative. Okay, so first, nationalism. We've been talking about this now for a couple of lectures, and here I just want to make a distinction between a few different types of nationalism because I've been talking about them as though they were monolithic, but of course they were not. First, we have to distinguish between popular nationalism, that is mass nationalism, and sort of top-down or elite nationalism. And while these are distinct things, very often the one could and did result in the other. For example, the Italian nationalist project was very much an elite project, particularly in the South, where much of the peasantry remained illiterate well into the 20th century. In such cases, it was a national idea created and circulated by elites for elites and then gradually fed down to the masses. Mass nationalism or popular nationalism of the kind that existed in France following the revolutionary and Napoleonic period, this generally grew out of some combination of common traditions or ethno-linguistic affiliation, and this led to a kind of nationalism known as integral nationalism. That is a very narrow nationalism, one that says at its outer reaches that the nation only consists of those born into it and of specific set characteristics. There is no, quote, becoming a member of that nation. That's at the extreme. On the more moderate end are those integral nationalists who believe that, well, actually you can make people into a member of your nation by forcing them to adopt your traditions, practices, languages, etc. This is going to become increasingly a prevalent view, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe during our period. And spoiler alert, it's definitely going to cause some problems. We hinted at that last time when we spoke about Magyarization. We are, of course, going to talk more about nationalism over the course of remaining lectures. However, any of you simply can't wait or think you might want to write about it for your research paper can check out a book also written by Eric Hobsbawm, whose specialty, or one of his specialties, was the study of nationalism. That's Nations and Nationalism since 1780. It's a short book, a series of lectures, actually, but there you have it, nationalism. Watch out for it, especially when I start talking later about the Eastern question, the disintegration of Ottoman control in the Balkans and the creation of new states there, as well as in the context of the democratization of societies, that is, the need, particularly for elites, to use nationalism as a means to tie themselves and the population together, that the general will finds its best, most effective, most organic expression through me, through the ruler. In fact, as long as I brought this up, let's just finish off with a few things I have to add regarding democracy, or specifically the democratization of what have hitherto been closed political systems. This is going to put a lot of strain on governments, even the already fairly representative ones, as in England. If you know anything about life during this period, especially in the swelling urban areas produced by industrialization, which is where the movements for more democracy were inevitably to be found, life was hard, dirty, and dangerous. Poverty was everywhere. Yes, it was true that industrial capitalism offered a means of mobility, social and otherwise, previously unimaginable. But conditions could be very desperate, especially if anything happened to make things worse. We talked about this in the context of skyrocketing food prices in the run-up to revolutions of 1848, for example. But as the country is as the century is turning, and elites in places like Prussia are resisting democracy and are going to use things like bellicose nationalism in order to deflect or detract from these concerns. And of course, I say the Prussians. It was the Germans, but it was the Prussian aristocracy, essentially, who were still governing. The British, of course, did this too. You can look up, for example, the cult of the empire. This was the period of time when you had the creation of holidays and celebrations to celebrate the empire, because then, as now, empire is very hard on your middle class and lower middle class populations. They have to make a lot of sacrifices. There's also the matter of public opinion and its growing importance. Who's going to back down in the face of public pressure? We see this today. This is the period of horse trading between insulated rulers has been taken off the board, and wars are now going to be fought over sacred territory, which can't simply be bartered away as part of a limited settlement. Conflicts will increasingly be total. People's wars, if you will. But anyway, that's growing democracy in an age of nationalism amidst a whole lot of other things, and elites are resisting or integrating or managing the influx or attempted entry of the masses into politics. Imperialism. I just mentioned it, so I'll do that one next. As I'm sure you are all sitting in upper-level European history class, you are aware that many of the various European states of this period had empires. The largest was the British, followed by the French, followed by a scattering of others from the remainders of the Spanish and Dutch empires to the Portuguese and Belgian, all acquired in previous centuries. Now, having unified very late, as we saw last lecture, Italy and Germany had not been included in the prior century's race to acquire colonial possessions. And you must understand that apart from the economic value that some of these colonies brought, it was a question of prestige. One of the hallmarks of great power was that you had a colonial empire. It wasn't the only mark for great power, mind you. Austria had no overseas empire, but it was a mark. And both Italy and, much more important, Germany are going to set out in earnest in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century trying to acquire colonies. Now, there aren't very many places worth having that have already been taken at this point. And that's a problem, what I'm going to talk about on one of our later slides, because quarrels over colonies are going to lead to a series of war scares in the decade or so leading up to the outbreak of the war. Now, it won't be too much of a spoiler to say that these standoffs over places like Morocco are shaped and decided by one of the other things on the slide there you'll see on Blackboard, and that's military alliances, the structure of military alliances. Now, as I'm going to describe the evolution of two hostile military blocs in the run-up to World War I in terrific detail in just a short while here, what I'd like to do is just mention here that the formation and continuation of military alliances during quote-unquote peacetime was highly unusual. It wasn't unheard of. Great Britain, for example, has effectively been allied with Portugal for about 700 years, but it was unusual for all the great powers to essentially be locked into a single set of partners. Traditionally, coalitions on the continent had been very fluid. Remember back to our lecture the other day, how Piedmont had allied with France and then with Prussia, or how Prussia had then allied with Austria and then Italy, etc., as the situation required. There were powers who were more or less permanently antagonistic during our period, such as Great Britain and Russia. But this fusing of two distinct military alliances facing off one another was unusual, and in large part because of the nature of industrial warfare, it required something else, something new, and certainly dangerous, because it reinforced these alliances in their rigidity. And this was joint military planning. That is, because of the speed at which you can mobilize your forces and get them into the field, fighting is a major determinant of who's going to win the war. Think of Prussia's wars against Austria and France. You have to make fixed war plans, therefore, between your militaries of who's going to do what and when. And there are going to be very strict timetables for this. And this really isn't possible to do and to practice and maintain if alliance partners are going to be constantly changing and we don't know who's going to be fighting who and whose side everyone's going to be on. And this segues nicely into the final topic, which is twofold. First, industrialization. Industrial production is going to play an interesting role in the run-up to World War I. And it isn't simply a question of, well, with machines and whatnot, we can produce more rifles, more bullets, etc. That's true, of course. But what is also important is the need to keep these large-scale industries in operation and ready to go in the event of war, which essentially means keeping them running during peacetime. This results in lots and lots of arms being built up. Secondly, and this is increasingly, maybe even equally important, I would argue, it's that industrialization and the need of states to fight increasingly savage wars and to win them quickly is going to lead to a lot of innovation in the armaments industry. So not only do you have lots of arms being built up, but you also have an actual arms race to produce larger and larger artillery, more and more powerful ships, etc., even things like poison gas. Combine all this with the general militarization of society, the literal glorification of war in schools, art, and literature. And apart from the draft, which we talked about, mandatory military service for young men in almost all European countries apart from Great Britain. You had the existence of things like naval leagues and rifle clubs, which in the former case were popular advocacy groups for like military spending in the name of national glory with bigger navies. And in the latter case, essentially weekend training groups for readying the population to be called up to fight in the event of a war. And you basically then have a tinderbox ready to blow at the slightest spark. And when it does blow, it's going to kill people on an industrial scale never before seen. But there had already been hints of this, which some commentators had made note of, such as the Russo-Japanese War, which occurs just after the turn of the century. And we will mention that again. Okay, but with all of this in mind, let's pick up our narrative where we left off on Monday in the aftermath of the final war of German unification, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. On your slide there, you'll see the unified German state is what you see, the Kleine Deutschland, or Little Germany, that is unified Germany, excluding Austria and dominated by Prussia. And the reason I have it up here on the slide, the reason I'm picking up the narrative arc on the way to 1914 here, is that its creation immediately destroys the balance of power on the continent, because almost immediately it becomes the single most powerful state, capable of taking on multiple of its neighbors at once. Apart from Russia, it is the most populous, it is the most industrialized, it is the richest in industrial materials, waterways, universities, you name it, Germany had it, except, of course, as we already mentioned, overseas colonies and the Navy requisite to protecting them. Ominous foreshadowing. We'll come back to that in a second. Because now I want to move over to talking about Russia, a country that got neglected terribly over the past few lectures due to its relative lack of participation in the phenomenon we spent the last few lectures talking about: industrialization, liberalization, unification, independence, etc. Cognizant of the time, we'll combine this look at Russia with a natural swing down into the Balkans, onto the Ottomans briefly, and then back up to Austria, the real sick man of Europe in the age of nationalism, where that spark is ultimately going to be kindled. Sharp-eared listeners will recall that the last time we talked, I mentioned the Crimean War and how Russia performed pretty terribly. Everyone performed pretty terribly, but in Russia, the war was something of a total scandal, and it prompts a push to reform. The serfs are liberated. Industrialization is going to be really fostered by the state. However, political liberalization is going to be fought tooth and nail. And this means that power will remain with the Tsar. And we talked about this in the context of Napoleon. If you have to have an autocrat, you could do a lot worse than Napoleon. And indeed, the Russians are going to tragically do much worse than Napoleon. Furthermore, due to its massive geography, the unification and industrialization of Russia is going to bring additional challenges. Challenges made all the more difficult by, for example, the Admiralty of the Navy being run by just one of the Tsar's random uncles. So that by the time of war with Japan, which they provoke, essentially the Tsar, with the encouragement of his cousin, who happens to be the German Kaiser, and who really just wants his cousin, the Tsar of Russia, to be distracted from what's going on in the Balkans. Anyway, by the time the Russo, that does tie into what we're going to talk about later in a minute. So keep that in mind. So the Russo-Japan War is provoked, and the Russian fleet is just a totally decrepit joke and gets slaughtered, literally to the last ship in man by the Japanese, who are very fast learners at industrialization and militarism and empire building. They only started in the 1850s. And this is what, 55 years later. I wish I had time to give you something more there, but I don't. So if you're interested in the history of Japan, take my class this summer on the history of Japan. Anyway, this loss is to cripple Russia militarily and handcuff it geopolitically as the Balkans crises unfold. Not to give too much away, but if you look at the next slide, you'll see the Bosnian crisis, for example, in 1908. Russia is supposed to be acting to defend Orthodox Slavic interests in the region as it historically has, usually by supporting its proxy and client state, the new state of Serbia. But having just been defeated in humiliating fashion and rocked by a subsequent revolution, that's the 1905 liberal revolution, not the big social revolution that'll come later during World War I. But the point is that Russia is powerless to act to stop Austria from annexing Bosnia, which it had previously been administering since the 1870s, late 1870s. But the point here, yes, is that public reaction to this failure is strong. And the Tsar essentially understands that he cannot let himself, his government, his country be humiliated like that again, or he might well be overthrown. Now, as for why the Austrians did this, the Ottomans being pushed out of Europe was leading to problems for Austria. The reason was fairly straightforward. The independent Balkan states Russia had been helped carving out of the former Ottoman Balkans territories raised the question of the status of Slavic, Slovene, Croat minorities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Understanding that while they were minorities, they were highly concentrated, specifically in the locations that it would eventually produce the states of Croatia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, etc. So suppressing or at least containing Serbian nationalist aspirations in the Balkan Peninsula was of critical national security import to the Habsburg Empire, something that was not being made easier by the Hungarians. Again, unlike the Hungarians who were trying to essentially allow for total cultural autonomy within the empire, the Hungarians were demanding that those peoples in its part of the empire be Magyarized, that is, become Hungarian in the integral nationalist manner we talked about in opening. And this fosters a lot of resentment on the part of the Slavs, and in particular on the part of the Serbs, who view Vienna as the main stumbling block after the Ottomans to an expansive southern Slav state or empire. It is their secret police, actually, who essentially helped Gavrilo Princip and his friends assassinate Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke, just to tie all that together. Okay, we're running short on time and we need to get everyone into position for 1914 in Sarajevo. So here we go. The German government understands that to avoid being encircled, it needs to stay on good terms with Russia, as France is now essentially assumed hostile, having been humiliated and had multiple provinces seized from it following the Franco-Prussian War. That means Berlin needs to stay on good terms with Russia. However, that becomes difficult to maintain. because the little Germany that Prussia's intentionally created requires the continuation of the Austrian Empire as a separate entity. Otherwise, why not just have all the German people in one state? For its part, Austria is effectively tied to Germany because there really was no other power Austria could turn to prop itself up. England, as a primarily naval power, was little help. France was visibly much weaker than Germany or Russia. Italy was weaker still. The Ottomans that Vienna was competing with in the Balkans, so too the Russians. So it was just Germany by default. But think about what I just said. The Austrians and Russians were competing for influence in the Balkans, and Germany was trying to be friends with both of them. Eventually, Berlin had to choose, and in order to maintain their domestic political equilibrium, the Prussian leadership of the new German state cannot but choose Austria. And there you see on the PowerPoint slide in 1890, the treaty between Germany and Russia comes to an end. France immediately steps in and courts Russia. Their interests are not in conflict, and they align in many ways, and the deal gets done very quickly, the next year, in fact. So zooming through the final decade, let's turn, as I run through some critical moments on that slide that you'll see listed here. Everything from alliances to German naval buildups to war scares to actual wars like the Balkan Wars. And then there in 1914, you see the outbreak of the war. So first, in 1898, the Germans begin building a large modern navy. This is what will ultimately, I think, tip the British into the Entente powers camp. That and seeing how easily Russia was defeated by Japan. Because as we talked about previously, during, I believe, the second lecture regarding Napoleon and why the series of British governments confronted by him refused to make peace, or a lasting peace at any rate, that's the British Empire rested on its mastery of the seas, its naval domination. And how if a power were ever to conquer the entirety of the continent, they could harness and divert the necessary resources to building a fleet capable of challenging British domination of the sea, thereby imperiling Britain's empire. Okay, and why does Germany want a fleet? So it can acquire the colonies commensurate to its status as a great power. This leads to a series of war scares, the most critical of which involve Germany attempting to bully France over control over Morocco. You can see those on your slide there. Tangiers and Agadir are the names of those ports. But the latter, that's France, having made a 1904 agreement with Great Britain, essentially agreeing to just put colonial matters to rest, to let the British have Egypt, essentially, as well as the canal that the French had financed the building of, and which the British had seized. Well, because of the French doing this, they're now basically able to call the British in to back them up, forcing the German government to humiliatingly back down. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is essentially the gist of it. And I am going to go into a little more detail on some of these things when we actually dig into our World War I lectures next week. Paradoxically, though, I think these war scares that eventually de-escalate had the unfortunate effect of reassuring leaders that the kind of cataclysmic war that many were now openly predicting simply could not or would not happen. That's just speculation, but so I digress. But 1914 comes around. Germany is by this point armed sufficiently now to do battle with Great Britain on the high seas, and they aren't about to back down again. Their domestic political situation, like Russia's, isn't going to allow for that. As already mentioned, Russia having backed down already in the Balkans, the government feels it can't safely do so again. Austria, its existence increasingly threatened, its very existence as an empire increasingly threatened over the question of Slav political agitations, feels it must act if they are provoked again by the Serbs. France, led by a Lorrainer who wants his home province back and confident Great Britain will back him, is ready to jump at an opportunity to get at Germany with the help of Russia. And then Great Britain, as we said, fears that Germany will, without its intervention, smash first France and then Russia and become master of the continent, thereby throwing into doubt the long-term sustainability of its empire, which it would ultimately lose anyway, in large part as a result of fighting this war. And that, everyone, is the road to World War I. Why did it happen? If you look at your last slide, the perhaps apocryphal words, but I've seen it in many sources of the Austrian emperor. If only we knew. Confident that they were controlling the situation, when the time came, the leaders of the various states found themselves acting in ways that were obviously destructive and which all of them wanted to avoid, but which they just were not strong enough to resist. Over the course of the next two lectures, we will follow the horrifying results.